White Mage, the first and only healer available to you at character creation, is a pure healer that specializes in using strong bursty heals to keep the party alive. They're also possibly the simplest of the healers, with their kit being incredibly easy to understand and learn, making them a great option for those looking to learn the healing role. But with that being said, here's everything you need to know as a new White Mage. To start off, let's quickly go over all our abilities, beginning with their damaging spells. The first of which is their go-to single target Stone, which is later upgraded to Glare. This is not only your main damage source, but also the spell you'll be casting most often. After Stone/Glare, we have Arrow, which will also be upgraded to a more powerful version in Dia as you get into the higher levels. This is White Mage's dot, or damage over time, that you'll need to refresh every 30 or so seconds. However, unlike Stone, the cast for the spell is instant, allowing for a nice bit of mobility anytime you use it. It also serves as a decent form of AoE in the early levels, as it can easily be spread between multiple enemies. Speaking of which, our actual AoE begins with the spell Holy, which, like Stone/Glare, is a casted spell that of course does AoE damage, along with also stunning any enemy's hit. A bonus effect which makes Holy one of the most useful pieces of AoE in the game. After Holy, we have Assize, our first OGCD, or off global cooldown, meaning that it's an ability that we can weave in between spells like Arrow or Stone. As for its effect, it does both AoE damage and healing, however, the damage is the more valuable part of the ability, making the heal just a nice bonus. And lastly, for our damaging spells, we have Afflatus Misery, an incredibly powerful instant cast AoE that requires 3 Blood Lilies to be used, a resource we'll touch upon shortly as we move into our healing spells. The first of which is Cure 1, a rather weak but cheap and fast single target heal that is basically abandoned the moment you unlock our next heal, Cure 2, which is just a more powerful but slightly slower and more expensive version of Cure 1, making it the better option in almost every scenario. And the last of our normal GCD heals is Regen, which lacks any initial healing, instead providing a powerful hot or healing over time to the target. Moving on to our normal AoE, we have Medica 1, which is just a simple AoE heal that, much like Cure 1, is rarely used because of the next spell, Medica 2, which does slightly less initial healing but significantly more healing overall, as it grants a powerful hot. However, even if you do end up needing more initial healing, then Medica 1 is still outclassed by Cure 3, a slightly smaller but more powerful and expensive AoE heal that, unlike Medica 1 and 2, can be cast on others rather than just being centered on yourself. Now, before we move on to White Mage's main gimmick, let's quickly run through all the different OGCDs. Presence of Mind is a buff that increases our cast speed by a sizable amount. Benediction is the strongest single target heal in the game, restoring 100% of a target's health. Asylum is a bubble that provides a powerful hot while standing inside of it, and is later upgraded to receive a buff that increases all healing by 10%. Thin Air provides a buff that removes the MP cost for your next spell. Tetragrammaton is a powerful single target heal. Divine Benison is a rather hefty single target shield. Planetary Indulgence provides an AoE buff, causing any of your AoE spells to provide a small healing bonus. Temperance is a 10% AoE mitigation that also provides a 20% healing buff specifically to your spells, meaning OGCDs generally won't receive the buff, but things like your cures and medicas will. Aquaveil is a 10% single target mitigation, and finally, Liturgy of the Bell is a powerful AoE heal that pulses each time you take damage up to a maximum of 5 times. However, if all the stacks aren't consumed, then it will simply explode when it expires or upon reuse, providing a slightly weaker heal than if you were to have the stack consumed normally. Now, the only thing left to talk about is White Mage's main gimmick, their Lily system. Earlier, we briefly mentioned that in order to use Afflatus Misery, you have to expend a resource called Blood Lilies. Well, this is something that is gained by expending normal lilies, a resource that builds over time while in combat, with you receiving 1 normal lily every 20 seconds. These lilies can then be used to execute 2 of your best healing abilities: Afflatus Solus, a powerful single target instant cast heal, and Afflatus Rapture, a powerful AoE instant cast heal. With the spells covered, let's now go over the job's general progression as you level. Now, the first 29 levels before you upgrade to White Mage are pretty simple, as the only real healing option you have is Cure 1. So while doing dungeons, you'll simply spread your arrow to as many targets as you can while a tank is pulling, and then when the party stops, you can use your Cure 1 whenever the tank starts to drop below, let's say 70 or 80%. Then while you're waiting for the tank to take enough damage to get to your chosen healing threshold, you'll want to continue doing damage, spreading your arrow to all the different targets, and then switching to your stone once you've spread it to everyone. Now, before we move on to the next set of levels, I do want to quickly talk about Swift Cast. This is a role action you'll gain access to at level 18, and what it does is make your next cast instant. One of the most common uses for this is to instant cast Resurrection when someone dies, as without Swift Cast, the spell normally takes 8 seconds to cast. However, this is not the only use for this ability, as it can also be used for emergency healing, as there may be moments when you don't have enough time to fully cast a heal. However, with Swift Cast, you'd be able to get that heal out faster, possibly preventing a death from happening to begin with. But with Swift Cast covered, let's move into the next set of levels. With level 30, you'll gain the ability to upgrade your Conjurer to White Mage by doing all the job's quests up to that point. Also, with the job upgrade, you'll gain access to a couple useful abilities in the form of Cure 2, which, as we mentioned earlier in the spell section, will effectively replace Cure 1, and Presence of Mind, which we can either use for damage or intense healing sections. And now that we have access to Cure 2, which is a stronger heal, we can start to push our healing threshold a little lower to, again, around 60 to 70% as a newer player, and as you get more comfortable with healing, you can even push that lower, again, if you're comfortable with doing so. But for the most part, the dungeon healing loop that you've gotten used to isn't really going to be changing all that much. We're just switching up our main healing option using Cure 2 instead of Cure 1. That being said, with a few more levels, things are going to change a bit as we get regen, because now we're going to want to start putting regen on the tank before they pull any enemies, and generally we'll want to maintain it when they stop. Then with a couple more levels, we'll see a bigger change as we obtain Holy, our first true AoE spell, and it's around this point that White Mage begins to feel much more powerful, as we start to get the real foundation of White Mage's true dungeon loop, which is putting regen on the tank before they pull the enemies, and placing your daunt on as many mobs as you can before the party stops. At which point you'll refresh your regen on the tank, weaving in Presence of Mind if it's not on cooldown, and then start spamming Holy, doing not only a large amount of damage, but thanks to the stun built into the ability, you'll allow the tank to avoid damage while they heal from the regen that you put on them before you started your spam. Then, when the mobs finally start to become stun immune, you can go back to using Cure 2 when the tank falls below your chosen healing threshold. And that's basically White Mage's whole dungeon loop, and it never really changes. You'll get some additions and upgrades, but at its core, you'll essentially be doing this same loop as you go through the levels. When you get Benediction at level 50, you'll use it after your Holy Spam before Cure 2. At level 52, when you get Asylum and Solace, you'll use the Asylum before your Holy Spam and the Solace afterwards before resorting to Cure 2 if necessary. Asize at level 56, you're just using for damage. Tetra at 60, again, is just more healing to use after your Holy Spam, and then Divine Benison at level 66 you'll just use before the tank pulls any mobs. Now, things will slightly change at level 74 because now you can start burning lilies in between pulls to build blood lilies for your misery, as it does a lot of AoE damage, but again, that's not something that's really changing the loop. And Temperance at level 80 can be used after your Holy Spam to further reduce damage and increase the power of your lilies, but by the point of Endwalker, healing dungeons shouldn't really be an issue. Aqua Veil can be used at any point to help mitigate damage for the tank, and not once have I ever actually had to use Bell for a mob pull, because more often than not, 1 or 2 lilies after your Holy Spam is more than enough to handle any big pull. Now, so far we've only talked about healing dungeon pulls, and the reason is that dungeon pulls tend to be endurance tests rather than bosses, which tend to focus more on execution rather than overwhelming you with damage. It's this reason that boss fights are usually going to be easier to learn as a new player because it's not that intensive. But with that being said, let's quickly run through the healing progression for bosses. Now, unlike dungeon pulls, these boss fights tend to focus much more on AoE rather than single target, which is why your best healing tool early on for any fight is going to be Medica 2. However, a common mistake new players make when it comes to this ability is not getting the most out of it. The power of Medica 2 comes from its powerful regen, and it's for this reason you want to let the hot built into the ability do its thing. But far too often will new players get the idea in their head that they need to fully heal the party after any damage. However, that is not the case. Rarely in normal content, especially early on, are you going to find a fight where you don't have enough time to let that regen fully work. So respect your Medica 2 and let it do its thing. And if you ever do need those quick emergency heals, then use Cure 3 instead, as without the regen, it's just the better heal. Now the first big healing change for bosses is going to come in Heavensward when we get Asylum, and it's at this point we start to build our healing priorities. Because now, instead of using Medica 2 when damage happens, we'll instead want to use our Asylum Burst and let it do the healing. Then if more is needed or if it's on cooldown, we can go back to using Medica 2 or Cure 3 if emergency healing is needed. Continuing on in our levels, we'll eventually get Planetary Indulgence, which we'll start to use before any of our AoE healing so we get an extra bonus out of it. And then the next big change for our healing priority will come with our AoE Lily of Flatus Rapture. Asylum is still going to be our first choice for healing, but because we never want to let our lilies cap, we'll also want to make an effort to use Rapture often. And will now only use Medica 2 or Cure 3 if we are completely out of lilies and healing is still needed. Now the last healing ability of note is of course our Bell we get at 90, and the best use for this is anytime a boss does multiple hits or inflicts you with a dot, that way you're able to get multiple pulses out of it. With the spells and leveling covered, let's now talk about tips to improve as White Mage. The first of which is managing your lilies. Since the only way you have to build your lilies is time passing, you have to keep an eye on how many you have and how long until you build new ones. Furthermore, once you get a Flatus Misery, you'll also want to make an effort to never let them cap, even if it means just wasting a heal to avoid doing so, because you want to build those blood lilies to take advantage of your powerful misery. Which it should be noted that since lily spells are instant cast, they're also great tools for movement, as you don't actually lose damage when you use a lily unless you're already capped on your blood lilies. Which actually leads us into our next tip, which is the fact that a Flatus Misery is DPS neutral in single target. You see, while Misery does have a potency of 1240, it takes 4 GCDs to actually use, as you do need those 3 blood lilies gained from using your lily spells, and then of course you have the actual cast of the Misery, which means that in the same time it took you to build your Misery, you could have cast 4 glares. But if you add up the potency of those glares, it would actually come out to 1240, meaning you lose no damage when healing with your lilies or using Misery. In fact, it's almost like you're storing your glares to be used in a single attack, which is why Misery is actually a DPS gain when used with any party buffs, because in a way it allows you to get 3 extra glares during that buff. And it's for this reason you always want to try to have a Misery ready for your party's raid buffs. Thankfully, since your lilies are on 20-second timers, that means that every other Misery should fall into that buff window. That being said, another way to know when a buff window is coming is by looking at your presence of mind, which should be up for every first window. And our last tip of note is learning to be more efficient. You see, something you should try to get into the habit of doing is reducing the number of GCD heals you use. Now, this doesn't mean your lilies. Instead, I'm referring to your medicas or your cures, as unlike your lilies, these are always a DPS loss. But I need to make something very clear with this tip. While the ultimate goal is to cut them out, that doesn't mean you should never use them. Because you see, the key to becoming a better healer is being able to recognize when you do and don't need to use something. Anytime you go to heal, you need to think to yourself, what can I use before I go for that Medica 2? Do I have an Asylum? Am I about to get a Lily for Rapture? Or do I have enough time to wait for one? But if I don't have these options available, I shouldn't feel bad or even hesitate about using those Medica 2s or Cure 3s. That being said, afterwards, I'll reflect on the fight and consider how I could have moved things around so that next time I don't have to use that GCD heal. Maybe there was a Lily I used previously that I could have saved for later, or perhaps I could have held my Asylum instead of using it earlier. You see, you don't need to be afraid of overhealing, but you do need to be willing to reflect and improve to reduce it. And that's basically everything you need to know as a new white mage. Now, if you found this video helpful, please consider liking it and possibly subscribing to the channel. Feel free to ask any questions you may have in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them if I'm able. You may also want to consider checking out another one of my healing guides like this one I did going over Scholar. But with that being said, thanks for watching, and I wish you the best on your healing journey.